Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate. Today I'm interviewing
Ananda Lima.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Very good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Like I said, just before we started recording, I'm so excited to talk with you today. So can you tell me about your book?
Thank you so much. So Motherland is a poetry collection that looks at the intersection of motherhood and immigration, and which were two sort of very big changes for me and who I am and how people read me that happened after I was an adult. And I think they influenced one another very much. So the book sort of centers around that.
And this book is just so excellent. As I was reading it, I just was fully just swept up in all of these beautiful poems. And I have a question about that. How did you know you wanted it to be poetry?
Thank you so much. The first poems in the book I wrote before I knew they were part of a book or part of this book. But I think poetry felt right early on because I'm writing about a lot of big themes. They're very big, and also a lot of little things like little moments with my son or just little moments of discovery. And I felt for me, with the style of poetry and fiction that I write, poetry is where I was able to have them together in the same object. I feel like fiction often requires more structure and a clear path that is fun, but it closes it a little bit, especially for a writer like me, or traditional fiction also. But poetry leaves all this space. And I think part of it is the visual space. Part of it is that you can leap and make more leaps. Part of it is that you can leave things a little bit more open. And I think that space allow the big themes to connect with the little themes in the same object. So I think poetry was just right for what I wanted to say in this book.
That is really awesome. And I know I totally get what you mean about having more freedom with it. Like some of the poems, like how you would have it be formatted differently. Like it would be a line and then it would have just a word out here and then it would go back, and that it really found a way. I don't know if I'm going to word this correctly, but with what I mean, but it almost drew me in more because it kept making me alert exactly what was happening in the book and knowing exactly what was going on in this poem. And I really loved that.
I love hearing that because, it really matches how I feel as a writer, when I'm playing with the spacing and the visual, all this stuff is very hard to paraphrase and summarize. And I think that is the point, because if I wanted to paraphrase and summarize, I would write a neat essay about it, which other people are great at doing, but it's just not my thing. But that space is a space that the visual and the space itself is speaking, and it's connecting with all the other stuff that is floating above from the other poems and from that poem itself. So all of that is part just as much as the words of how I'm saying what I'm saying. And you thinking about it, it's exactly great.
Yes, totally. Kind of switching up what we were just saying, but how, did you order the poems in this book? Because I had an author on recently, and this was a short story collection. But she said that she had to outsource for that. And I was very surprised. So I was I hadn't heard about that. So I was curious with this.
I just love that idea in general. Think about how other person would do it, even if I didn't end up using the order. But no, I ordered it myself. I think it's it's kind of a little bit similar to writing a single poem. It's just a longer process. So, there's a feeling this is an early one, this is a late one. There's a sort of intuition about like a high level where things are going to go, but it's kind of imprecise. And then I sort of experimented. So I would order them and then have it like that for a while, then reorder, and I had a few versions. And it took a while that I working on this book and even sending it out, and it kept evolving. I think when I found the 3 parts and that one poem that was sort of beginning, I was like, oh, it felt right. It felt like I was getting closer. And then when I got to this current form, it felt right with the themes and the sort of rhythm, of them together. So basically, there was an initial feeling for some of them. This is an early one, etc. But it was through experimentation that I arrived at the final form. For this book, I don't think I could have like outsourced, because it would have been just maddening. But like I'm thinking about it, this would be a very fun exercise for my short story collection.
Yeah, it was really interesting when I heard that, and it really depends on the person. Like I'm the kind of person, if I was to publish something, I would like need to have total control over every single aspect. But I know some people, it can help them get out of their heads or any number of things.
That's right, and just be fun to see, like,
yeah. Yeah, because it can provide a whole new perspective on the writing.
Right. Exactly. Very cool.
So how did you decide on putting it into 3 defined parts?
Yes. So I think I had 2 parts. There was writing this book, it went through a range of what was happening in my life that was full of contour and change, both my kid growing, there's so much change that happens from a very tiny baby to like a kid. There's a lot happening. And also in the country, there was so much happening. And also in my immigration, there was so much happening. So there's like a very wide range of time. So I felt like some of the poems, they had a quality, an experience of immigration that was a little bit, it was earlier for me. So it was more of discovery, and, it was before the past president, and then there's a later one that is a little bit more exasperated, So I first had this idea of these sections, and then this poem, Ronald Reagan, I think, oh, that's a good turn between these 2 modes. So that's kind of what gave me the idea of sections. So I had 2 for a while, and then I had also this other later, this sort of more like survival or like standing up, mood came up. So then I the 3rd section emerged, but these were just sort of the seeds of the sections. That's kind of how it started, but in the end, it didn't end up the way I paraphrased it now. That was just how I decided to break into sections. And then I sort of moved it around, both to do with the concept, but even sound or how I felt about them, intuitive things. So I came up with a more conceptual start, but in the end, I sort of let go of that top level control a little bit and just did what intuitively felt right in those 3 sections. Yes. And then when I had them as they are now, that's when I was like, oh no, this is done. Like these are the sections,
That's really cool. And I love that, like, kind of what you've been saying for a lot of this. It's like you just kind of knew for a lot of the things.
Yeah.
It's gotten to this point. So what inspired you to write Motherland?
Yeah, so I think it was very powerful experiences that were happening in my life. And these are, both the motherhood and the immigration and my experiences around that. Were long lasting, right? It's not something that happened one day, it's over the years. And things that affected me deeply. And as a writer, also gave me a lot of sense of play at the same time. So I think it's something that emerged naturally just from the living it and writing it. But when I first started, I didn't know that this would be the collection. I was just sort of writing poems and reacting to, in the very beginning, what was happening to me. And then I saw that this would be a thing that I wanted to explore for a while in a unit. So that's kind of how it evolved.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So do you have a favorite out of all the poems in this book? Or if you can't pick one, also, any of the themes of the book?
That's so great. So I love being asked about favorites. I can never pick a favorite of anything, but I always try. So instead of saying favorite, what I'll say is there are some poems here that I think represent either the collection or things in the collection very well. So for example, in section 1, the poem Line, which now I'm reading a lot again because of that, because I think it represents the collection so much. Mm-hmm. So the poem Line has a lot of what it's a good sort of frame for a lot of the book. And I think the poem Line speaks very much to the poem Meet and to the poem Arroyo. So I think it's kind of a core poem. The first poem, I think, so In-Flight Entertainment, While the Doomsday Seed Bank is Reached. That one, I also think that it kind of connects the collection to something above it, which I like. It's kind of like a zoom in, here we are, and then it goes into that, but they're very connected. So I like that. And then I'll mention maybe a couple more. And then Berimbau, the very last one, I really like what's happening sonically in that poem. Like just the sound is nice. I like when I read it, I like what's happening in my mouth as I read it. Mm-hmm. And then some of them, like Monday Between Impeachment or something, and The End of the World. I like that because I think it turns to the end of the book. It sort of, I think it represents that section. It's a little bit less accessible, but I think it sort of, it arrives at the closing section for me, emotionally, that and that one I wrote it here in Chicago, I was
that's
living
where I am.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh, I love Chicago.
It's amazing. Great. Yeah.
I love it. I was like, why haven't people told me about this place? It's great.
It's always fun when authors come on here that are out here too.
Oh, they're so fun. Yeah. And I moved like 2.5 years ago, so, but, there's been the pandemic, so, but I still love it. Yeah. But this one I wrote in Chicago, and it's the very end of the book is when the Chicago one's made. So I like it because it's kind of the opposite of the other one. It's nice, in a nice closing. So yes, these are some that I like for different reasons, but I'm very bad with favorites.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I totally get it. That's why I ask the questions. So I don't have to answer them.
That's great.
And something I kind of want to touch on, like just as you were saying some of these titles and talking more about the poems, I want to talk a little bit about the language use, because that was something so interesting. Now I do not speak Portuguese, but I still felt so connected, like just hearing like just reading the words, because a lot of, just for anyone listening, the book is in English and in Portuguese, and it switches between. And can you tell me a bit about the decision to do that?
I love that. That is so fun always to hear about how it is for somebody who doesn't speak Portuguese, who was very much in my mind as I was writing this, right? You have to think about a lot. So there's a bunch of things. I think on a high level, looking at the poems together, um, I have, so because I'm an immigrant, right? But I think that's not unique to immigrants. It's anybody who's in a group where they are missing a lot of the context, right? Like, so I mentioned sometimes like a first generation college student or any sort of transplant from any situation. So a lot of the time, for forever, for many years, and still today, um, people are talking about stuff, and often I don't know what they're talking about for a section of it. Like references. Do you remember that show back in the 90s or that commercial in the Super Bowl? I have no idea what people are talking about. But so I think it's interesting to give that experience to the reader. I think it's healthy for people to um, especially sorry, if they don't have that experience often, to go through that experience. But I think it's not just about sort of exclusion, even though I do think that is interesting. It's also because I really enjoy that not knowing what people are talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's kind of like when you travel too, like when you travel, and sometimes I don't speak the language, but that is part of why I went there. It's part of the beauty of it, So I think often, also in reading conversation, but also in reading, if I'm reading something and I don't know the reference or I don't know what they're talking about, I enjoy the experience of filling it up with either looking it up or just imagination and filling the gaps. I love that. I think it's an enjoyable thing. So I thought that would be a fun thing to have there too. So that's kind of a more high level. But just in terms of me expressing, like me as the writer, that's a very natural mode to me. So I think that also worked. Um, so these are kind of high level things, but in the poems themselves, I just think it's a very fun formal challenge. Just you have some poets who love working on form all the time, for example, just because it's fun to figure it out. For me, that having the two languages became a very fun thing to think about and to figure out on a formal level. So I thought of different ways that they could either be harmonious together or be in tension with each other together. And that became fun for me. And I also thought of different ways to give a reader something to follow along. And sometimes there would be, repeating forms. So if you know the form, then oh, this line is a kind of translation of this line. So that gave a key in some poems. But even if you don't know the form, you can see the cognates, right? And that give you a partial thing. And sometimes just the sound, So I was very interested in what kinds of things I could give the reader, even though they didn't speak it, and see what kind of bridges could be created. And there was a lot of fun in this book.
Yeah. And you were saying earlier that it was like not focusing on exclusion, but like trying to play with that. And for me as the reader, I felt even more a sense of inclusion. Like I was being like let into this other world that like I haven't really had any experience with. And like
that's wonderful.
I thought that was something really interesting because I haven't found that in a lot of books that I've read. And it was really
cool. So lovely. That's great.
So out of all of the poems in this book, was there one in particular that was really hard to write, or a few that were hard to write? Because this is a very personal book, as we've been saying. And yeah.
Right. Yes. So I think they had very sort of different challenges. Some of them, yeah. So I think they had different challenges. I think the Madrugada, let me see. So I think Madrugada at Grandma's was hard, and like because of the generational stuff, it's kind of like hard content. Um, I think there is this one, Fungi, um, in the second section. It wasn't hard emotionally. Fungi and Every Moon, they're together here. But these were very stubborn poems. They would not like. I was like, oh, maybe I can make them more, easier on the reader. They will not go there. They wanted to be what they wanted to be. So I think these were hard. I think the first one was hard because it made me very sad. But I think, I think sometimes they're hard, but they also help. So for me, there wasn't anything here that I was very upset that I wrote the poem, because I think that can happen sometime. You're like, you're hurt by writing the poem. Here, it was more of I was feeling it's just there's always so many things going on, but it was just such a dreadful time, like sometimes, and just trapping them into words helped instead of having this nebulous feeling. So even the ones that were hard, I think they were helpful, and it made me feel better after I wrote them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you for answering it in two different ways too. When you were saying like that this one was like just hard to write, like, and then there were some that were like hard emotionally and stuff. Cause I think that just as much can happen in writing, where it'll be like, I have to get this story out, but also the words aren't necessarily coming to me, or it's, yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
So you reference a lot of like writing and poetry in this book. Where did you get the idea to put that in to the book? And like, at what point in the process did that start happening?
That's such a great question. I love that, because that always comes up in my fiction, but like usually just, we never get to talk about it. So I'm very interested. That is something that is common to all, so I write fiction, poetry, and I take pictures, right? So all of those three things, I'm very interested in the writing itself, and like the sort of the medium, and what it making contact with the truth but not being the truth. So I'm very interested in for example, I don't know, realistic fiction. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so fake because it's written, So there is a layer there. There is the author and the writing, and I think it's important to even though it's enjoyable to forget it sometimes. I think it's important to remember that both as a writer and as a reader. And the reason I say that is because of not only my work, but all this stuff you see everywhere, right? So I think it's important to think about the ideas in a book as the ideas of the author. And I don't mean like this character represents the author. No, but like
sometimes like the wider themes too.
Yes, exactly. So that you can put it into perspective and question it when necessary. And I do think that maybe we're in a moment that this is more thought about, because there's so much discussion. There's like Twitter or whatever, not to say that everything that people say is reasonable, but people talk about the idea that this was created by a person and it's a creation. And I am very interested in that in all the mediums. And I also feel like writing is an important experience as any that I have. And it is very much part of this living that is sort of being um, a basis of what I create. So it's kind of a very present and interesting thing to me. But I love that you brought it up for
Mhm.
this book
Well, it
because
was so interesting to hear you talk about it. I also really find it cool that how you were saying it, like it's almost like death of the author, but like not like the reverse of that.
right.
Which is interesting. And like I fully get what you mean. I usually am someone that like agrees with death of the author, like putting not killing authors, just put that out there, but like not looking at like the person and going and looking at the work. But in a case like this where it's something like personal and it's something like, remember, this is not just like, this doesn't just exist in a vacuum. This is a real person writing this. And I think I love hearing that from when an author puts that in somewhere.
There you go. That's so cool. Yeah, and as a reader, I like it, and I think it it goes both in this sort of more personal sphere, but also I feel um, for authority. Like sometimes, um, especially when reading like classics or canon or whatever, there's so much authority that is implied in
Mhm.
other works, and I'm like, let's remember this is not like, this is a person who has opinions, and they may be right, they may be wrong, so I think just
Mhm.
there's many different ways that it can be interesting to think about it as a reader and as a writer.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Um, so how did you get into poetry?
Very good. So yeah, I love that question because I I sort of recognize myself and announce myself as a fiction person first, but I
Mhm.
write so much more poetry.
Mhm.
um, Today, I know now, like poetry is my primary thing. But I wrote poetry like as a kid, but it was really kid poetry. It was just like little rhymes or whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, but when as an adult, I wrote as a very private thing that I had no, it was very private for a long time. But when I first started showing people stuff, it was fiction. But I was writing these stories, and a lot of times I'll be like walking or doing stuff, and I'll get this image or this line. I'll get a line, and then I'll try to write a story to have that line,
Mhm.
and it was completely wrong. I'll be like, this story is. I don't like anything on the story except for this line. And
Mhm.
then slowly I figured out, no, these things are poems. They don't want all the story around it. Um, so it kind of called to me, and I wasn't even thinking necessarily at first that those things were poetry. But once I started writing poems, it really took over. And I went to an MFA in fiction. But even during the MFA in fiction, I was writing more poetry than fiction. And I love writing
Mhm.
fiction, but it really is clear to me now that it's my primary medium. But that's not how it was when it first came. I didn't realize that straight away.
I totally get what you mean, because I kind of am the same way too, where I'm always like, oh well,
Ah.
I write, and then I like try to write fiction. I'm like, oh no, this isn't right. And then I write poetry, and it's like, oh, this feels way
uh,
more accurate.
very good.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's such an expressive medium too. It's so much fun to like play around in.
that's right. And yeah, it's just all that space and possibility. It's great.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on this show. This was so much fun to talk with you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And thank you for your beautiful reading and preparation.
Oh my gosh, of course. Thank you for this beautiful book. Anyone listening, go out and buy this book. It's really excellent. I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Yeah. So this book is just came out, so I'm sort of going around and doing events and things. But I
Mhm.
am writing now. I have a short story collection. Um, which who knows, I may outsource the ordering. No, just kidding. So I have a short story collection that I am going to be revising this year. And I think I'm going to hopefully finish this year. And I do have sort of a nascent, very early stages next poetry collection that I identified as a collection now, which is going to be kind of to do with vision. But that is going to take a long time. So I think it's going to be short story collection and then poetry, next poetry collection.
That's awesome. Well, anytime if you want to come back on the show to talk about anything, I would be happy to have you back on. This was really great.
Thank you so much.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
Thank you. I'm Ananda Lima.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.